Hello everyone, Phreak here. I wanted to do a video on magic resist and magic damage dealt as of the 2018 preseason. The big thing that I've noticed, or one of the big things I've noticed in conversations, talking with players, the general sentiment around the game is that damage has gone up, durability has gone down, everything's squishier, everything dies all the time, the game's very snowbally, and everyone dies all the time. I know a lot of those points are the same point, and that's kind of the point I'm making, is that it's been a very common trend to see people talk about the damage just going up kind of everywhere. And the thing is, in a lot of this, you can actually just do the math and know if the damage really has gone up or down in various places. So the first thing I looked at basically is I said, okay, let's just drill down to talking about magic resist. And to be fully clear about this video, I am only talking about magic resist and magic damage in the game as of the 2018 preseason changes. There's more you can do to talk about armor. We're not doing that right now. Okay, so what you're looking at right now is a segmented chart. It might be confusing. Let's break this down. Okay, right here we're talking about what level the champion is. And for the sake of easy comparisons, I'm assuming the champion dealing damage is the same level as the champion taking damage. Theoretically, these things could have changed a little bit. But what I looked at is I said, okay, a very standard Mage rune page has magic penetration marks, and it runs Thunderlord's Decree in the Cunning Tree. And we're talking about, the 2017-2016 season. And alongside running Thunderlord's Decree, they would have also run a mastery called Precision, which gave, I believe, 1.75 to 6 flat magic pen based on champion level, scaling linearly. And that was the vast majority of all mages. And if you weren't running Thunderlords, you were running Storm Raider Surge, like if you were a Cassiopeia or a Rise or something. But the vast majority of mages ran something like this. Even support mages like Zyra would often do something very similar. And so I said, okay, what kind of target could you be attacking? Well, you could be attacking a champion that had no magic resist in any of their runes at all, in which case it's this set right here, before meaning like 7.20, after meaning 7.22 and beyond when the preseason patch came out, okay? So some people would run 0 MR anywhere, like if you're playing support Zyra or any support mage, you often ran ability power or magic pen glyphs. 3 flat was actually really, really common. Most mid laners ran this. They would run 6 scaling cooldown reduction glyphs so that they would eventually hit 10% CDR, and they ran 3 flat MR glyphs for almost any magic damage matchup, and so they would have this here. Another common rune page was just running 9 flat MR glyphs. This was a lot of tank supports. This was a lot of, or basically every single AD carry in the game, Ashe, Misfortune, etc. They would all run this. Also a champion like Fiora, when she's going up against, say, a Cho'Gath or maybe a Maokai or a Cassiopeia top for whatever reason, or just, if you ended up being melee into ranged AP, this could sometimes happen. And then the final rune page that was somewhat frequent was 9 scaling magic resist glyphs, and this could have been a, consider something like a Lee Sin who might not have gone attack speed or cooldown reduction glyphs. Now, a lot of times they did, and Lee Sins would run 9 attack speed glyphs, and they'd have this kind of page, but a lot of the times as well, they might have a bunch of scaling magic resist so that they can be tanked in the late game. Sejuani might have been an example of this as well. Again, this was a really, really, really common page for a lot of champions because people loved scaling CDR as a glyph. So this is actually probably the most likely rune page to run into. It's also a nice average. But anyway, that's what this is talking about, okay? And so what we're doing here is we're saying how much magic resist did you have against their magic pen marks, against that precision mastery, with whatever rune page you're going to run before. And in almost all of these cases, the only case where it's not this case, in almost all the cases, I'm assuming that you're also a squishy yourself. You're playing Ashe, you're playing Elise, you're playing Zyra, you're playing Ahri, right? So this is, Forgiven playing Ashe, this is Zyra support, this is Ahri in the mid lane, this is actually, someone like Ashe in the bot lane, well, if you're not Forgiven. And this would have been like a Fiora or a Lee Sin jungle where they ran scaling. It's not really that important, but you kind of notice that this goes from 30 to 38.5, and this goes from 32 to 53. It's because in this specific column, we're talking about what a tankier champion would have been running, because scaling magic resistors almost only ever run on melee. Okay, now that we've described what we're talking about, let's go into the specifics. I have color-coded based on damage dealt. Red meaning that as of the preseason changes, you are doing less damage to this champion. Green meaning that after the preseason changes, you're doing more damage to this champion. Okay, yellow meaning the magic is the same number. Okay, so if we're a mage running the old precision mastery, running magic penetration marks, we're basically a mid laner or a support mage, or maybe we're even a jungle mage. This is what we're looking at, okay? For the uber squishies, if you're fighting against Forgiven, if you're fighting against Elise in the jungle, and Elise was running like full flat AP, and I believe Elise has ranged champion stats, but you are definitively doing less damage to those champions, right? And there were lots of champions who ran really aggressive, greedy rune pages in order to do more damage in the jungle. And none of these runes multiplied their MR that already existed. So this difference of 10 magic resist or down here about 8 magic resist, that number would stay the same whether you're looking at a Lee Sin or an Elise or a Zac or an Urgot or Darius or Yasuo or Ashe or anything like that, right? This number, this 9.5 difference, or in this case, I guess it's a 10.5 difference, this 10.4 difference, right? That would have been the same regardless. Just kind of making sure you guys are aware of that, you know, how big the difference in numbers really would have been, this 14 point whatever difference, okay? So to the tune of 10 to 14 magic resist, the full squishies are definitely taking less damage from the hyper-aggressive mages, okay? And if you consider the fact that Sorcerer's Shoes got buffed by 3 magic pen, you still don't come close here. All right, let's talk about the most frequent mid lane matchups, right? Ahri versus LeBlanc, Syndra versus Karma, Cassiopeia, and Rise doing battle, right? In these cases, this was in 99% of the cases, every mid laner ran the exact same rune page of magic pen marks, 3 MR glyphs, and scaling CDR glyphs. And again, the difference is about 5.5 magic resist at level 1, and it's about 10 magic resist at the end of the game. Now, again, if you ran Sorcerer's Shoes, you could close that by 3, because after the fact, their Sorcerer's Shoes got buffed in League of Legends in 7.22, so that closes the gap a little bit. But mages, again, are tankier against other mages. You have to make up 7 magic resist or 7 magic pen, which simply doesn't happen with the buffs to Sorc Shoes. It simply doesn't happen with the buff to Void Staff either. Okay? So mages are tankier against mages, right? Not just the full squishy greedy guys, but every mid laner ever ran this page 99% of the time, and they're tankier. Okay, let's move on. What about those bot laners we were killing? What about Ashe and co? What about those guys? And okay, now we start to get a little bit closer. All right, if you were running 9 flat MR glyphs, the difference is 2.5 MR. All right, and if you were somehow hitting an Ashe at level 1 with a LeBlanc chain, yep, it's going to do 2-ish% more damage. Sure, absolutely. Now, in more realistic terms, you're probably going to roam down around level 6, in which case, at level 6, the magic resist difference is 1.2. Okay, well, that's not very high anymore. No, it's really not. And in fact, it breaks even at level 11. At level 11, now to be fair, if you weren't buying Sorc Shoes, which of course a lot of us are, at level 11, it's the same number, right? Because the precision mastery scaled with character level at a certain point, it's not bonus damage anymore. And in fact, in the late game, if you never bought Sorc Shoes, if you never buy a Void Staff, if you're going, you know, cooldown boots, Luden's Echo, and like if you're playing like a Malzahar or something like that, or if you're playing Cassiopeia who can't buy boots, yeah, until you buy a Void Staff, in the late game, the AD carries are actually tankier than before. They have more magic resist. And this counts, you know, playing support Leona with MR glyphs. This counts support Nami with MR glyphs. I mean, anyone who just ran 9 flat magic resist glyphs was in this boat. And of course, if you are only running 3 or 6 or 5 or something, then obviously it's more like this where there's no contest. But absolutely, yes. I mean, to a certain degree, of course, you are doing more damage. And again, if you buy Void Staff, that's 5% more pen. If you buy Sorc Shoes, that's 3 more flat pen. There's ways, of course, to add damage, of course. And then finally, the final example of a somewhat frequent rune page would have been someone who said, okay, I'm I'm not dealing with magic damage in my lane, but there's big magic damage threats in this game. There's an Elise, there's a Karthus in the mid lane. I really want some magic resist. I'm going to run scaling glyphs. In which case, well, as a result of the changes, you're in fact doing less damage in the beginning of the game. Now, that was the entire point of that rune page, of course, right? Obviously, you're seeing these inflection points, right? Running flat MR versus scaling MR, the inflection, right, is about in the same place. This is, of course, of no surprise to anyone at all, but you have similar sort of shape to what's going on here. Okay, yes, if your would-be target was running scaling MR, you're in fact worse off in the early game. No one's surprised here. But yeah, the guy who was going for the greedier scaling magic resist rune page would have had 10 more MR against you than they do now because they don't have that option. They don't have that greedy magic resist page anymore. Now, certainly, yes, we have the new rune called Conditioning where you get 8 armor in magic resist at 10 minutes into the game, which is around level 8-ish. In which case, bam, back to the red you go. But I'm not trying to like compare runes to runes. I'm comparing base stats to base stats, okay? If you want to start, because all these runes got compensated in a certain way, I don't want to compare magic resist values to runes reforged because that's not really what these base stat changes and these magic pen changes were about, right? That was just the systemic landscape the game is in, and then the runes can play from there. So I'm not trying to get into that at this point in time. Because those comparisons are much more apples to oranges, okay? So basically what it comes down to is for your lane opponents, mages do less damage than before. For the uber squishies like the magic pen supports and the really aggressive greedy junglers, you're doing less damage than before. Against the bot lane marksmen who are running flat MR almost all the time, you're doing... to be honest, I would say you're doing more damage than before because you're doing more damage in the early game. And by this point, you probably have Sword Shoes or a Void Staff, which pretty much cuts the changes out. Against some of the greedier tank players who were running scaling MR, yeah, you're generally doing more damage than before because you aren't really fighting them in the early game. Okay, so that's the comparison, right? Is if someone's saying, ooh, there's less magic resist, so the mage is doing more damage, yes and no, right? The only one where I'd really say, yes, mages are doing better for sure is this case here because the greedy scaling build doesn't exist in the same vein. Obviously, again, conditioning exists as a rune in Runes Reforged, but again, we're not bringing that up here. Okay, so mages, honestly, were about a wash, right? Mages are doing about the same amount of damage. Let's move forward. This is what happens when you take the same targets, right, the same rune page as those targets from before, and you say, hey, what about the ones who weren't running Magic Pen, right? No Magic Pen marks. They're not running the Precision Mastery and the Cunning Tree. We're talking about Maokai. We're talking about Zac. We're talking about a Mumu. We're talking about the sort of the Soraka supports of the world who weren't running Magic Pen because you shouldn't have, the Nami supports of the world who shouldn't have been running Magic Pen, just the generic do-gooder or, you know, magic damage wasn't their primary consideration champions. What this also often means is these are the champions who already got compensation anyway, right? Maokai got attack speed marks. Corki got attack damage marks, and in 7.24b lost a lot of his attack damage to make him more fair, because that's what should have happened, and I'm glad it did. But these are all these champions who basically, let's explore how much these champions won because of the fact that they happened to deal magic damage and yet got the free compensation that all the mages got. Well, if your opponents weren't running any magic glyphs before, and they still aren't now, it's literally the same system because you weren't running Magic Pen before either, and so no one got anything. So that's easy. Okay, great. But if you were, for some reason, I don't know, like, because Galio mid actually did run Magic Pen to my recollection, so it's not like this is, oh, Galio in mid is doing better, but let's say you're playing Zac jungle, which is what I mentioned at the very beginning, who usually ran attack speed glyphs, as opposed to an Elise who actually ran Magic Pen. Or let's say you're playing an Evelynn jungle, and Evelynn jungle used to run attack damage marks. I said glyphs a second ago, I meant marks. Evelynn used to run attack damage marks for her jungle clear. She didn't run Magic Pen, so Evelynn would be looking at this when she ganks mid. Maokai, when he roams out of the top lane, is looking at this when he ganks mid. or when he's facing the Nautilus in the top lane, because Nautilus is probably also going 3 flat MR glyphs and a bunch of scaling CDR in his other spots, right? This is a really, really common rune page for basically every solo laner and a lot of the junglers out there. So Maokai is doing a 4-ish% more damage at level 1. And by the end of the game, it's still a 4 MR difference. Obviously, again, there's no magic resist to look at, but you're doing, 3 to 4% more damage if you're a Maokai against these types of champions. What about against the bot lane? The bot lane they were actually running magic resist glyphs, right? The Leona supports were running them, Ashe was running them, Karma was running them sometimes. Sometimes you run flat AP, but it was up to her. Really depended on the matchup. But yeah, now there's actually this 12 magic resist difference for the Maokai. When Maokai ganks bot lane, yeah, he's really doing like 11% more damage now. Wow. Okay, 11 is probably a bit lofty, but let's say, 8% more damage, something like that. That's really meaningful. Every Maokai TP does 8% more damage to the AD carry. That's significant. I mean, Maokai does decent damage. And as we saw in the 7.24, I think it was 24, maybe it was 23 patch notes, Maokai lost damage on his Q because he was one of the big winners of reliable magic damage that reached backline that tended to target the Dravens and Callistas and Ashes and Misfortunes of the world. Turns out, yeah, that was a really big deal. He was a big systemic winner. Rammus jungle, again, when he goes to gank bot lane and he taunts Ashe and turns on Tremors and has Ball Krill running, ow, yeah, he's doing 8% more damage with all of that stuff. That's a really big deal. And then if you were against a slightly greedier rune page, someone who was running scaling MR, obviously they don't have that anymore. So just like this page, yep, you're doing more damage to them. But worth really pointing out that in the end game, that these greedy scaling MR tanks used to have 77 MR against you. They have 53 MR against you, which is a pretty substantial cut down. Now, yes, again, these types of champions would probably still be running conditioning as a rune of choice in the new system, but once again, we're not doing the apples to oranges comparisons. We're only looking at the base level considerations. Okay, I want to bring up one more thing, which is to be fair and accurate to the math. Let's talk about the mage versus mage example one more time, because we talked about how mages are doing less damage to mages, and that's not completely the full story. Because yes, they're doing more damage because of the magic resist, but mages were the only class in the game to, instead of getting flat benefits, right, getting 15 attack speed at level 1, getting 8 attack damage level 1, getting 9 armor at level 1, they got scaling health. And mages, and actually for every champion in the game, scaling stats are not linear. Runes in 2016, 2017, and beyond, or before, runes in the past, in 7.21 and earlier, were linear, 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, 72. Base stats are not linear, and so this is what this shows you right here, is every mage got 12 health at level 1 and 12 health scaling. Whereas before, they got 12 health per level, counting level 1, from seals. And so this column down here on the right, as I try not to cover the chart too much, is how much less health they actually have because of the different system changes. And for those of you who looked at my patch preview or patch rundown from a couple of videos ago, this is what I'm talking about with the linear scaling when I was talking about Yasuo and whatnot. This is that kind of thing, right? This is the non-linear scaling and compensation at level 1 and things like this. So at its very, very worst, it's a 15 health difference. This is not a large difference. It is 15 health. At this point in time, champions have about 1,300 HP around that point in time. So, I mean, you're looking at, a 1% health difference going from 1,500 down 15. This is not huge, right? This does not make up for the 8 magic resist difference, roughly, that you're seeing in this kind of situation. So including the rest of the numbers, mages are still definitely tankier against other mages. Now, there's one other thing to point out, which is, of course, that magic resist and magic penetration is, of course, not the entire scenario. In the real world, playing League of Legends, runes really do exist, and they contribute damage. And so what I want to do for you is play a clip from the All-Star event. Hopefully the sound comes through just fine. That happened very recently, as of this recording, about a week or two ago. And it was a fight between Xie and Faker.
Let's see this one again. How did this happen?
Have to wonder what the comms are here, because we know that Stan United is up. Get away. He has to flash away. Of course, cleanse doesn't work on damage over time abilities. Faker will know that, so he seems genuinely surprised. Remember, damage values are different than they were back at Worlds when there was plenty of Malzahar running around. Crown playing it 3 times in the grand final, and the damage just crept up onto Faker, and he seems bemused that he fell down.
Yep, turns out.
All right, so that was the line. This was Papa Smithy's explanation of Faker's death, and the goal of this is not to call out Papa Smithy. And to be fair, I think he actually worded his statement very well. I actually think Papa Smithy is a great commentator, a great person. And in fact, what's funny is when I went to find this clip, in my memory, I thought he had actually said, like, Magicus was lower, damage is higher across the board. I thought he was actually much more sort of ostentatious about how much damage is in the game now, from my recollection. After, obviously, we all watched that clip, that's clearly not what he said. And he said that damage is different, which is, okay, a fair statement. But I've heard a lot of people, commentators and not, talk about how, ooh, damage is so much higher. And in the case of physical damage assassins, it might actually be, and that's the thing we can dive into at another time, but that's not the point of this video. What I'm doing here is looking at mages once again. And so, I did one more thing, and I actually looked at how much damage Malzahar does at a thing like Worlds and at a thing like Preseason, okay? So let's talk about what this is, okay? So we're looking at Malzahar's E just to use one ability because it's much easier to look at only one ability, okay? So we're looking at Malzahar E. The base damage is 220 when you're a level 11 Malzahar, and you've maxed it out because of course you have. I went and looked at Crown's rune page and mastery page from Worlds, and I went and looked at Xie's rune page from All-Stars 2017. The AP ratio on Malzahar E is 0.8, and the amount of damage that Malzahar's Malefic Visions, his E, deals based on how much ability power Crown had versus how much ability power Xie had were these numbers, right? Very, very similar, but, you know, six off. In fact, there is more ability power in the system when All-Stars was played, which was at 7.23 than before. Now, since 7.23, Celerity got nerfed from 4% to 3% movement speed. And the overall sorcery path bonus got cut by about 5 in, if you're an inspiration primary, like inspiration into sorcery, it got dropped down to 22. And it got cut down by a little bit if you were a sorcery primary as well. And so this 6 damage, meaning about 9 ability power more, is going to be cut down to about the same number at this point, based on the nerfs to Celerity and the sorcery. But at the time of this recording and the time of that game, this is definitely the case. Crown ran Deathfire Touch. I simply chose the full 4 seconds of Deathfire Touch as the damage output of what Malefic Visions would do. That seems like a happy medium. Certainly Deathfire Touch can have its damage overlap, and damage doesn't actually overlap, it doesn't stack, so you can get less damage than expected out of Deathfire Touch because you hit your ability at the same time. There's ways for that to happen, but at the same time, Scorch, which we're also including here for Xie's damage output, maybe was up, maybe it wasn't, but the fight was probably about 20 seconds long, so it was probably up at the time, but Scorch did about the same damage that Deathfire Touch did, which is a very, very cute sort of thing. Then we also looked at the fact that in the old game, looking at Worlds, there were 2 masteries that amped damage. Actually, there were more than 2, but there were 2 that Crown used. He had Double-Edged Sword, which is do 3% more damage, receive 1.5% more damage yourself, as well as, I think it was called Sorcery, which is 2% more spell damage. Also, at Worlds, Faker ran Double-Edged Sword on every champion he also ever ran, which is 1.5% more damage taken. And so in the old Rune and Mastery system, there was a 6.6% almost global damage amp on any Mage versus Mage fight, as long as you went anywhere reasonably far down the offense tree. I think it was the ferocity tree back then, where you got your 2% damage amp from sorcery, you got your 3% damage amp from Double-Edged Sword, and the other mage took 1.5% more damage from Double-Edged Sword as well. So there's a 6.6% damage amp there. And we all plugged it back in to, and we chose Azir with this example, all right? We said, okay, Faker's playing Azir, and if we just ported present day Azir to Worlds and edited his base stats back, edited his runes back, put Crown's runes back in as well, and all this stuff, how much durability did Faker have? Well, not counting double-edged sword, because this has been counted for right here, Faker had 1,757 magic damage would have to be dealt to him to kill him from full HP. That's how much damage Faker would have had to take from magic damage in order to be killed from magic damage. In All-Star, that number jumped up. And keep in mind, I am counting Crown and Xie's both magic pen in this. I'm also assuming that Crown had Xie's build, that Crown had Xie's items. So, right, we're saying the same Malzahar, the same level with the same items, using Crown's runes and mastery versus Xie's runes and masteries, looking at Faker's runes and masteries from Worlds versus Faker's runes and masteries from All-Star, and then just saying, yes, he was playing Azir in both cases, which is a lie in the case of Worlds, but I think still a reasonable situation to use, okay? And I said, okay, here's how much magic damage durability they would have, baking in all the magic pen and the magic splits and whatnot, and they said, okay, well, if it did this damage plus this damage plus this damage multiplied by this against Faker's durability, how much damage was really dealt? What percentage of Faker's health was really destroyed here? And at Worlds, in the same situation with the runes and masteries that Crown and Faker used, if Crown had the same items that Xie had and he hit Malefic Visions, he would have done 24.29% of Faker's health. Right? He would have cut a quarter of Faker's health off with his Deathfire Touch and everything else. Bam, there you go. With the runes and masteries and everything. At All-Stars, Xie, with the build he had, with the items he had, with everything else, with Scorch on, with Faker on his current runes and masteries, would have only done 22.17% of Faker's health. This is a 10% damage amp, right? Crown did 10% more damage per Malefic Visions than Xie did, all right? 10% more damage, because going from 22 to 24 is a 2% amp, which is 10% more, right? It's 2 percentage points or 10% more. And I hope that makes sense to you guys. Trust me, it's true. So the difference in damage, again, that is way more than I expected. Like, I thought the numbers would be reasonably close, but they actually aren't. Like, I know 24 and 22 look similar. It is really a very big difference. This is a 10% damage amp, but it's mostly from masteries. Right? It's mostly from these points in mastery. So we already know, we've already kind of exhumed all the runes and whatnot. But this is what happened with the masteries that existed in the systems. And what's funny is this is counting the fact that Crown ran Resolve Secondary in his masteries at Worlds. He got 20, so he didn't go Cheap Shot or whatever it was actually called, Draw Blood or something. I forget. He actually ran Feast when he ran the Ferocity Tree. The 20 health and he lasted a minion every 30 seconds. He ran the Health Regen in the Resolve Tree. He ran -2 damage from Tough Skin. He ran 50 bonus health from Veteran Scars. He still got the same 15% Summon Spell CDR and Insight. And of course, he's missing out on his 10% scaling CDR glyphs that Crown would have had that we're not counting in this damage calculation. But this is a guy who chose to go for a defensive option and still would have done 10% more damage than Xie did. That's substantial. 10% more damage with the Resolve Secondary. And yes, I want to point out that I did count the 7% magic pen as opposed to the flat pen coming out of Precision and Vendorlords. This math really is accurate. But because very few people play Malzahar compared to the rest of the champions, I only did the Vendorlords sort of numbers and whatnot. We look at Xie's champion. Again, now Xie, to be fair, right, was an inspiration primary. He ran Unsealed Spellbook. A lot of other champions could be doing more damage, and that's completely reasonable, right? When Jace is running Summon Airy and has Coup de Grace and all these things, sure, right? There are some differences in other cases, but this is the example case I am using. And otherwise, again, we get very apples to oranges if we're going to look at every champion ever and try to actually math this out properly. So let's talk about what Xie actually had on his rune page as well that we're not really accounting for here. Well, he got more than 15% Summoner CDR because of Unsealed Spellbook, and he could swap his runes around, or his summoners around, which is pretty cool. He had 20% potion and elixir duration from being in an inspiration primary as well. He gets free stopwatch from being perfect timing, free boots from being magical footwear. He gets another 5% summoner CDR as well as, active item and ability CDR from Cosmic Insight. And he also gets some movement speed out of Celerity. Now, it's kind of hard for me to tell you if, the extra 15% summoner CDR is better or worse than 50 health necessarily. if the movement speed from celerity and the movement speed from perfect timing and the extra potion duration, all this, like at a certain point, it's hard to compare these things properly. You can look at them and decide which one you want more for yourself. My instinct is Xie's extras are better than Crown's extras, and that's probably fair because, again, Xie is doing less damage. If he's also getting less out of Runes Reforged, then he's just screwed in all cases. So I think it's reasonable that Xie probably got more out of his other choices than Crown did. But I counted the ability power from celerity, right? I counted the ability power from going for an inspiration primary in these numbers over here. And so I wanted to really point out how much damage is actually being dealt, right? Scorch is doing the same damage that Thunderlords. Scorch is doing the same damage that Deathfire Touch would have done in this case. Keep in mind that Thunderlord's Decree would have done about maybe 160 damage, something like that. Thunderlords would have done about 160 damage here before Magic Resist, which is really quite substantial. It's about 3 times as much damage, right? Now, of course, that has a cooldown, sure, as does this. Comet would have done less than that, but, again, we're getting into apples to oranges comparisons, and I'm kind of running out of topics to talk about. Ultimately, what I wanted to bring up is this, right? This is the primary conclusion here, is Malzahar in the exact same scenario against the exact same target did 10% more damage at Worlds than he did at All-Stars. And that's the big finding. And then if you're going to play a tank, you're doing more damage in all cases. And if you're playing a mage, you're doing less damage in a lot of cases against most of your opponents. That's the point of this video. That's what I wanted to bring up. And yeah, that's kind of the ultimate conclusion here, that your keystone and everything else has to do the heavy lifting in your damage output because the base damages are not as good otherwise. Thanks for watching. You guys are amazing, and I'll see you next time.